Go here. Can you guys all see it? All right. So, Descartes Meditations. How do I? There we go. Rene Descartes, there he is. That's the one famous picture of him. He was born in 1596, probably or possibly in Le Haye-en-Turin. The story goes like this. So he lived on his maternal grandparents' country estate. And we know for a fact that his mother was very pregnant and on her way to the estate to give birth. The question is where? The town of La Haye, which claims to be Descartes' place of birth, say he was born at home. The neighboring town, which has renamed itself Descartes in order to claim the title, says that what actually happened was that the mothers wanted to pull over and that she gave birth to Descartes in a ditch in their town. And then they continued on to where he grew up. So both towns neighboring claim credit for being the place of birth. Now, his mother actually died while he was a toddler. She soon was pregnant again. She and that child passed away, and we know that Descartes himself was sick. He had a lung ailment. We think it was most likely tuberculosis, and this lasted almost all of his childhood. So where other kids were running around and playing, Descartes was just stuck inside. The one joy he had was he was given free run of his grandfather's library. And so he became, from a very young age, a book nerd. And he adored reading, he adored learning. And his brother, his older brother, gets sent off to school, and he just wants nothing more than to go to school where he could just learn and learn. He's too sick. Eventually, he becomes well enough to send. Now, he's still ill, right? The lungs still were not healthy. When he was at this school, it was the finest school in France, a boarding school that was on the former estate of the king. He was seen by the faculty very early as being just brilliant, and he was so far ahead of all of his colleagues that where everyone else had to get up at 5, they had mass at 6, then classes started at 7. He was allowed to remain in bed until noon. This would be a habit he would continue for most of his life, keeping what we call philosopher hours. So yes, I apologize for getting you up before Descartes would even be here. He was to remain in bed in a well-ventilated room until lunchtime. And the thought was that the fresh air would help the lungs. And so he would spend half of every day just lying down, staring up, bored. Now, one day, he was looking at the ceiling, which most likely was like the ceiling in, most of the classrooms, how they have those tiles so it looks like a giant grid. He was watching a fly. The windows were open, fly came in, so he's watching the fly zoom around, and he has a realization that geometry, the subject he loves more than anything else, and we'll get into that in great detail in a bit, Euclidean geometry wasn't sophisticated enough to be able to handle the trajectory of this fly, right? If, picture how a fly randomly sort of curves around. The geometry wasn't strong enough to handle that. And he thought, that can't be right. Something's wrong here. And as he looked at the grid ceiling and the fly flying around it, he had a realization. And that was the realization that we could account for the curve in terms of equations. It was Descartes who first thought of the idea of graphing. And that realization, which came to him as a student in school, high school, turned into what we now call analytic geometry. the ability to graph curves, right? Before Descartes, it was thought that mathematics had two completely separate realms. There was geometry that dealt with shapes and squishy qualitative notions, and then there was arithmetic, algebra, right? Things that dealt with numbers, equations, more exact. It was Descartes who figured out how to bridge them. And that was one of the most important advances in the history of mathematics, because it allows mathematics to be used for all of the sciences. Before Descartes, science read like philosophy. After Descartes, it reads like science as we know it. And it was all because, as a child, he was sick watching a fly on the ceiling. So he graduates from school. Slowly, he gets healthier and healthier. And by the time he leaves school, he's healthy enough. There were three routes that you could take. He was not French royalty. There was still royalty in France at this time. And so if you wanted to move into the middle class, there were only three routes. You could become a priest, which he actually thought of for a while because his teachers were priests and he adored them. You could become like his father and his brother, a lawyer. And he actually was sent to law school. He did 3-year course in only 2 years, came out at the top of his class, and law just bored him to tears. So while he trained as a lawyer, he decided he was just too smart to be a lawyer, and so he left that. And the third route was the military. And so he joined the army, but not the French army. He joined the Dutch army, which is really weird. Not only was it a different country, but you got to remember that at this point, the big division between nations in Europe was religion. France, of course, is a Catholic country. Holland, Protestant. Why would he fight for a king of the enemy? And the answer is, well, the Dutch at this time were at war with Spain, and Spain was Muslim, and everybody hated them, so it was okay. So he joins the Orange Army. Now, in the wintertime, it was simply deemed too cold to fight, and so the army was quartered. That is, citizens were forced to put up a soldier in their house, and so Descartes was in the home of a Dutch family. He didn't speak Dutch. So he's in a house with nothing to do, can't talk to anybody. What do? You meditate. And it was this period that actually gives us his most famous work, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. So after he leaves the army, his mother passes away, which leaves him a significant amount of money. So now he's young, he's well off. What does he decide to do? He's going to travel. And so he and his manservant are traveling through Europe. And they're sailing at one point across some large body of water. I forget exactly which one it was. And he and his manservant were both French, so they were talking in French. The sailors, however, were from Holland, and they see this very wealthy gentleman, and they get an idea. And so they plot to murder and steal all of Descartes' possessions. They plot in Dutch because they've only been speaking French. He won't know what we're saying. They didn't realize he just got out of the Dutch army, where he had learned to speak Dutch. He had learned to fence. And so, just before the deed was about to take place, Descartes, out of nowhere, springs on the biggest one, takes his forearm against his throat, pins him against the boat, pulls out his sword, puts it to the guy's throat, and in perfect Dutch says to them, "I know what you are trying to do. You will take the lifeboat, you will take my possessions, me and my manservant, and you will right now row us all to shore." Well, they were stunned, and they did exactly as he asked. So this is the one case in the history of philosophy where if you were going to have a philosopher played by Bruce Willis, this is the one time you actually had a philosopher action adventure hero. So At this point, he makes his way back to France. He settles into Paris. He becomes a part of the growing intellectual scene at the time, right? This was just as the scientific revolution was occurring. It was a lively time, and Descartes has these ideas, and so he starts to write them. But this was just after Galileo's trial. And so all the intellectuals knew that this was a dangerous time for them. And so what Descartes does is he leaves France in order to write, and he moves back to Holland, because Holland, at least not being Catholic, was a little bit more liberal. But even there, Descartes was a nervous sort. He was a scaredy cat. And so what he would do is once a month, he would pack up his goods, he would move to a new house in a new city every month, so nobody knew exactly where he was as he was writing. And on all of his correspondences, he would put a fake return address. Could find him because the things he was writing were so unorthodox that they could lead, as we saw with Galileo, possibly to a death sentence. Ultimately, he does publish. His work becomes very important, although it was at the time highly edgy. He is called by Queen Christina, the Queen of Sweden, who loved philosophy. She decided she wanted Descartes to be her personal philosophy teacher. And so Descartes moves to Sweden, which is dark, which is cold, and Queen Christina decided that the only time she had in her royal schedule for her lessons was 6 o'clock in the morning, which of course was not Descartes time. The cold weather, the early hours. He doesn't last more than a year before he dies. Now, this is 1650. There had always been some skepticism about the story of his demise. And so about 15 years ago, they actually exhumed his body and did some chemical tests. And they found trace amounts of arsenic. They think that one of the priests in Sweden was slowly poisoning him his whole time there because he thought that Descartes, with the Cartesian philosophy, was a heretic. So, was he murdered? Was he not murdered? We don't know, but there's some evidence saying it may well be the case. So what philosophy is so controversial that it could get you killed? Let's do it. This is dangerous. So what we're going to look through is his work called the Meditations. And this is his most famous philosophical work. No student should graduate with a degree in philosophy who hasn't worked through the Meditations. This is such a wonderful piece because it really starts setting out a lot of the puzzles that to this day philosophy continues to wrestle with. So, like I say, he was at this point in the Dutch army. He was housed in a home with people whose language he didn't speak. It was cold, it was dark, he was bored. Now he says in another piece where he goes over roughly the same material, the discourse of method, that after the day's baking was done, now historians are divided on this. Some of them, the more boring of the historians, say a poella is a small stove-heated room. Others say that no, a poella is an oven, that he would wait for the day's bread to be baked, and once the oven cooled down, he would literally tuck himself inside the oven where it was warm and dark, and he would just think. I tend to prefer the second explanation because it is much funnier, and for me that's a mark of truth. It also explains why some of his ideas are only half-baked. So, what we see in this piece are two really important things that are going to set the stage for the entire rest of the semester for us, right? What I said last time, and we're going to see it again today, is that the hallmark of the modern period is that epistemology comes before metaphysics. We're going to see Descartes start with epistemological questions, questions about knowledge. How do we go about knowing things? How do we gain knowledge? And the answer he's going to give is what has come to be called rationalism. That is, the justification for all knowledge is human reason. We'll see when we get to our next figure that the opposing view is empiricism. No, that the foundation for all of our knowledge is observation, is sensation. What we'll see Descartes do very quickly is get rid of the senses and yet keep working. Descartes is the father of modern rationalism, and that's really what we're going to see in this piece. But out of epistemology comes metaphysics, and what we will see is the famous view of Cartesian dualism. Cartesian is just the adjective of Descartes. Dualism means that it's a metaphysical view. Remember, metaphysics is the study of reality. It's the view that that reality is made up of two different kinds of stuff. There's material stuff, matter, and then there's mental stuff, minds, souls, ideas. And when you see the word soul in Descartes, read it as mind. The notion of soul and mind at this point meant exactly the same thing. It's not until really 20th century psychology that the two get teased apart, and soul has only the religious meaning. Here, soul is just that which motivates human action. So that's sort of the overview. So let's get there.
Hi, Steve.
Good morning.
I
No
am
worries.
so sorry. I forgot it was 10, and then I turned off my alarm, and then I fell back asleep, and then I saw the time, and I was like, oh my God.
No worry. All we've done is biography at this point, so you just missed some fun stories, didn't miss any actual philosophy. So where should we start? Probably meditation 1. So the heart of what he is doing is what's been called methodological skepticism, right? Skepticism is the view that we can't know anything, right? It's an epistemological view that says there's nothing that can be known. Methodological skepticism, that is, what he is going to do is actually give us a method to test whether there's something we can know. And the heart of that method is going to be doubting. And so here's a famous passage from the beginning of Meditation 1. Some years ago, I was struck by how many false things I had believed, and by how doubtful was the structure of the beliefs that I had based on them. I realized that if I wanted to establish anything in the sciences that was stable and likely to last, I needed, just once in my life, to demolish everything completely and start again from the foundations. It looked like an enormous task, and I decided to wait until I was old enough to be sure that there was nothing to be gained from putting it off any longer. I have now delayed it for so long that I have no excuse for going on planning to do it rather than getting on to work. So today I have set aside all my worries and arranged for myself a clear stretch of free time. I am here quite alone. He's in the oven, and to demolishing my opinions. So the idea here is, for Descartes, all human knowledge is based on philosophy. Philosophy is the foundation. So if you think of all knowledge as a building, philosophy is the foundation of that building. And if you try to build a building without a firm foundation, right? Monty Python shows you what will happen, right? It's not a good thing. So here's just an example of the metaphor. My wife has some cousins up in around Albany, New York, who are building this beautiful home. And it has this gorgeous sort of 2-story open living room with a fireplace in the middle. And then one day, the husband was driving home from work, and he noticed that an old building had been taken down. And there was this huge pile of these really old, gorgeous bricks. And so he asked the foreman, what's happening with these bricks? He says, well, we're just taking them away. Why, did you want some? He goes, yeah. He says, I could brick in this fireplace. It would be gorgeous. He's like, take all the bricks you want. So got his pickup truck, made several trips back and forth, and they bricked in this 2-story gorgeous fireplace. Well, the foundation for a house, the thickness, is determined by an engineer based on the plans of the house. They hadn't planned for 2 stories of very heavy brick in one spot. As a result, the foundation torqued, and they had these huge cracks running up and down the walls of their house. That's what Descartes wants to avoid metaphorically, right? If we don't have a firm enough foundation underneath the building of our knowledge, it's not going to stand. And so what do we need to do? We need to consider every single thing we believe, tear it all down, and try to build it back up from the ground on up with absolute security, absolute certainty. That's the key. That's the goal of this methodological skepticism, to take everything that might be false, throw it away, and build everything we believe on a foundation of absolute truth so we can be absolutely firm in our convictions about everything we hold. He wants to know, what can I know? Now remember, he went to school thinking that's what school would do for him. He was deeply disappointed because in every subject, you have this smart person saying one thing and then another smart person saying the opposite. There was only one place where it wasn't the case: geometry, Euclidean geometry. And how does geometry work? We start from absolute truths, and deductively, we derive all other truths. That is going to be what we call the method of doubt. Tear everything down, get to absolutely certain foundations, and then build up with absolute deductive certainty. So he sets forth for this method a criterion of belief. I can do this without showing that all my beliefs are false, which probably is more than I could ever manage. My reason tells me that as well as withholding assent from propositions that are obviously false, I should also withhold it from ones that are not completely certain and indubitable. So all I need for the purpose of rejecting all my opinions is to find in each of them at least some reason for doubt. So that's it. We want certainty. This is the key. Descartes will settle for nothing less than absolute certainty. So if there's any reason to doubt something, we will treat it as if it's false. He's not saying it is false. He's saying if it might be false, it's not good enough to help me rebuild this structure for knowledge. So we are going to treat as if false anything that's even possibly false, anything that could be doubted, even for the most bizarre or stupid reasons. If it's not 100% guaranteed, it's not good enough for us. Okay? So this is a very high bar he's setting here. So he needs to go through all of his beliefs. But as he says, I can't go through them one by one. I believe lots and lots and lots and lots of things, right? So it'll be better if I go through categories. See if I can get entire chunks of things I believe and take care of them all at the same time. So the method of doubt, once again, destroy and rebuild the foundations of our knowledge. I can do this without going through them one by one, which would take forever. Once the foundations of a building have been undermined, the rest collapses of its own accord, or you at least get large cracks in the walls. So I will go straight for the basic principles on which all my former beliefs rested. And the first ones he starts with are empirical beliefs, right? Empirical just means observable. Right? What do we believe on the basis of empirical evidence? Well, you believe that you're in a room. You believe that you have a nose. You believe you have a body. You believe there is an external world. So there are a whole lot of external beliefs, all of science, right? He says, whatever I've accepted until now as most true has come to me through my senses. But occasionally I have found that they've deceived me. And it's unwise to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. So there is the beginning of his first argument against the absolute trustworthiness of empirical beliefs. Why? Well, our senses have deceived us, right? Optical illusions, or you ever thought you heard something and it turned out to be nothing, or you see somebody that you think you know and it turns out to be somebody different, right? Our senses aren't 100% accurate all the time, and so for any given observation, there is a reason to doubt them, right? And so that's the argument from sense errors. But then he makes a second argument, and this is one that will come back, and that's the argument from dreams, right? Now, Descartes is not saying that he thinks that all of reality is just a dream, right? What he's saying is something simpler, right? Have you ever woken up from a dream and then been like, oh my God, thank God that was just a dream, right? Have you ever at the moment when you were dreaming not realized you were dreaming? Have you ever in a dream thought, oh, I'm just there? If that's ever been true, then for any given observation, you can't be 100% sure at the time of observation that you aren't dreaming. Because what happens in the mind, Descartes argues, is the same sort of process as when you observe things when you're awake. So if you're dreaming and you dream of a chair and you're awake and you look at a chair, what's happening in the mind is the same thing. So if we're going to simply rely on the internal observation of a chair, we can't be 100% certain at the time we observe it that it isn't a chair we're dreaming about or a chair we're seeing when we're awake. And so if even the slightest hint of doubt exists, for Descartes, that's enough to just throw it away. So if there's any doubt, throw it out. If Descartes had a car, that would be his bumper sticker. Okay? So the fact that perceptions while we dream are of the same sort as waking perceptions give us reason to doubt any perception, and therefore they
Steve,
can't
my
be
internet
trusted.
is breaking up. I'm going to have to disconnect and then try and reconnect again because nothing is going right now. I'll be right back.
No worries. So with that, we have empirical beliefs thrown away, which means what do we lose? We lose the chair, we lose the computer, we lose the external world, we lose your body. We lose seemingly everything, right? What's left? Rational beliefs. So while it is true that the overwhelming number of our beliefs come from our senses, Descartes says, well, there are still some beliefs that we can still hold. And those are ones that we get just through the reason. That is, ones that we don't need a body for, he says. So it seems reasonable to conclude that physics, astronomy, medicine, and all other sciences dealing with things that have complex structures are doubtful. Right? We've just gotten rid of all those because we've gotten rid of observation. While arithmetic, geometry, and other studies of the simplest and most general things, whether they really exist in nature or not, contain something certain and indubitable. For whether I'm awake or asleep, 2 plus 3 makes 5. A square has only 4 sides. It seems impossible to suspect that such obvious truths might be false. So the idea here is, while science may come from observation, mathematics comes from pure reason. And so even without a body, you could still do math, right? So mathematical beliefs aren't touched when we throw away all of our empirical beliefs due to the 2 arguments he gave in the previous section. Do we have good reason to trust our rational beliefs? Well, he gives 2 arguments to say that they're not indubitable either. All right? The first is the argument from reasoning errors. Now, Descartes is one of the great mathematicians in history, and yet he still double-checked his arithmetic when balancing his checkbook. Right? We make math mistakes. We make reasoning mistakes. So for any given inference that we make from the reason, is it possible that it's false? Yeah, it's possible. Then he gives what's probably the most famous argument, well, the second most famous argument in all of Descartes' writing, and that is the argument from the evil demon. It goes like this. We frame it these days as the brain in a vat argument. How do you know you are the person you think you are, living the life you think you're living? How do you know you're not just a brain floating in a vat of medium connected to a supercomputer? And that supercomputer is programmed by an evil genius, right? Everything you think comes from your brain, right? Maybe that brain is not being stimulated by an external world, but by electrical impulses being fed in. Yes, this is the matrix, right? For Descartes, who didn't have supercomputers back then, he said, how do you know there isn't an evil demon that's just feeding in every thought into your head, right? When I say 1 + 1, what do you immediately think? 2. But of course you do. The evil demon is making you think it, and it's wrong. Observe every inference you make. Everything that's happening in your mind is happening because it's just a puppet of the evil demon who's feeding in falsehoods. That's why he's evil, because he's constantly lying to you, making you think that there's a coronavirus, making you think that you're a philosophy major, right? All of this is false. It's just the evil demon. Now, Descartes' not saying this is probably true. Descartes is the first to admit this is really stupid. But is it possible? Because remember, that's all he needs. If it's even possible, then we can't believe everything we think, anything we think, with absolute certainty. If it could be the case that the evil demon, and he says, as stupid as it is, it's possible. And if it's possible, that's enough. So notice what we've lost. Everything that comes from the senses, everything that comes from the mind. It seems like every single belief Descartes could possibly have is false, right? So this destructive phase of the method of doubt seems like it was a little too effective. We can't believe anything. Methodological skepticism has led us to a full-blown skepticism. We can't know anything. Now, this is a little disconcerting, especially since there's more in this piece and more in this semester. So could it be that we can't know anything? Well, again, here is the challenge of the evil demon, right? So I shall suppose that some malicious, powerful, cunning demon has done all he can to deceive me, rather than this being done by God, who is supremely good and the source of truth. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, color, shape, sound, all external things are merely dreams that the demon has contrived as traps for my judgment, or blood or senses, but as having falsely believed that I had all of these things. I shall stubbornly persist in this train of thought, and even if I can't learn any truth, I shall at least do what I can do, which is to be on my guard against accepting any falsehoods, so that the deceiver, however powerful and cunning he may be, will be unable to affect me in the slightest. So, seems like it's all gone, but is it possible that there's still something that escapes the threat of the evil demon? And here's where we start meditation 2. He opens with a restatement of the project, right? I will set aside anything that admits of the slightest doubt, treating it as though I had found it to be outright false, and I'll carry on like that until I find something certain, or at worst, until I become certain that there is no certainty. Which is such a great sentence, because how can you be certain if there is no certainty? Ooh. So with the evil demon, is there anything I can know? And the answer is yes. This is his most famous argument. It's what we in the biz call the cogito. I'll explain that in a bit. And he works it out in this piece as in his head. The hopeful voice and the doubtful voice. Can I get two of you to read? Let's do this as a little play. Joe, you want to be hopeful?
Sure.
Julia, you want to be doubtful? These are two more of the seven dwarves who never actually made it to the big leagues.
Hopeful.
All right. Hopeful.
All right.
Hit it.
Scene. Still, how do I know that there isn't something, not on that list, about which there is no room for even the slightest doubt? Isn't there a God, call him what you will, who gives me the thoughts I am now having?
But why do I think this, since I might myself be the author of these thoughts?
But then doesn't it follow that I am, at least something?
This is very confusing, because I've just said that I have no senses and no body, and I am so bound up with the body and with senses that no one would think that I can't exist without them. Now that I have convinced myself that there is nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies, does it follow that I don't exist either?
No, it does not follow. For if I convinced myself of something, then I certainly existed.
But there is a supremely powerful and cunning deceiver who deliberately deceives me all the time.
Even then, if he is deceiving me, I undoubtedly exist. Let him deceive me all he can. He will never bring it about that I am nothing while I think I am something. So after thoroughly thinking the matter through, I conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, must be true whenever I assert it or think it.
Bravo. Outstanding, you two. So there it is, right? He thinks, one proposition that even the evil demon cannot wrongly convince him of, and that is that he exists, right? So the idea is simply this, is that the evil demon can fool me about anything I think, but in order to fool me, what has to exist? A me to be fooled, right? So the idea is that even the possibility of the evil demon presupposes that he is fooling. So in another work, the Discourse on Method, which is basically sort of the Cliff's Notes to the Meditations, Descartes walks to the same argument, and that's where he has his most famous quotation, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, right? Which is probably the quotation you'd heard from Descartes before. This is what it comes from. This is the solution to the evil demon. This is the first truth. This is the truth that no matter what cannot be denied, and that is that I exist. Why? Because I think, right? To be fooled means to believe something, right? I believe things, I doubt things. But to think is to do, and you can't do without being a doer, right? Action requires an actor, right? So the idea here is that if for him to fool. So I do have at least one thing that I can believe with absolute certainty, regardless of the existence or non-existence of this evil demon, and that is the existence of the self. I know I exist. Well, it's something, but how much is it really? Okay, so the self exists. But the question is, what kind of thing is this self? And he says, strictly speaking then, I am simply a thing that thinks, a mind or soul or intellect or reason. These being words whose meaning I have only just come to know. Still, I am real, a real existing thing. What kind of thing? I've answered that. A thinking thing. And a little while below, he says, well then, what am I? A thing that thinks. What's that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wants, refuses, and also imagines and senses. So the idea here is he is just a disembodied floating thinking thing. He's just a mind, right? That's all he has proven. He hasn't proven that knows he's a thing that thinks. So We allow that mental acts are real, right? Doubting, understanding, affirming, denying. What he can't say is that the content of those acts, what he affirms, what he believes, what he denies, what he wants, are themselves real. So the content of the act or the source of the act, we don't know, right? Did I choose that? Well, I don't know if what the thought is about is real or true. And here's where we come to another very famous passage in Descartes, and that is the piece of wax. So here he's sitting in front of a fire, holding a piece of wax, contemplating its essence. I don't mean bodies in general, for our general thoughts are apt to be confused, but one particular body. This piece of wax, for example. It's just been taken from the honeycomb. It still tastes of honey and has the scent of the flowers from which the honey was gathered. Its color, shape, and size are plain to see. It's hard, cold, and can be handled easily. If you rap it with your knuckle, it makes a sound. In short, it has everything that... But as I speak these words, I hold the wax near to the fire, and look. The taste and smell vanish. The color changes. The shape is lost. Its size increases. The wax becomes liquid and hot. You can hardly touch it, and it no longer makes a sound when you strike it. But is it still the same wax? Of course it is. No one denies this. So what was it about the wax that I understood any of the features that the senses told me of? For all of them, brought to me through taste, smell, sight, touch, or hearing, have now been altered, yet it's still the same wax. So the point of this wax example is that the nature of a thing is not in its observable properties, right? He's worried about what the self is. He's worried about what things are. So here we've moved from epistemology to metaphysics. What really is a thing? And we think, okay, a thing is its property. So we're using epistemology, our senses, our knowledge, to get to the underlying essence of the thing itself. And he says, but wait a minute, look at the wax. I have changed every single observable property of the wax. There is nothing in the liquid wax that is the same property as in the solid wax. The color is different, the shape is different, the temperature is different, the smell. There is nothing that's the same observationally. And yet, is it the same wax? Yeah, it is the same wax. So what is it that makes a thing a thing? Where is reality? How do we get to reality? It can't be through the senses. So he says, seeing isn't an atomic act. I don't just see it, right? I have to make some judgments. There's intellectual additions to anything from the senses that actually gets me to perception. And here's where we pick it up on meditation 3. And this will be the last one we'll do today. He starts now with what we consider the central question of metaphysics. But my main question now concerns the ideas that I take to come from things outside me. Why do I think they resemble these things? So you guys who have taken me before have seen me draw this same cartoon on the board many times. You know, there's a poorly drawn person looking at a chair, right? So there's a poorly drawn chair and the eye is looking at the chair, and then there's the cartoon bubble with the chair in it above the head, right? And so the idea here is we look at a chair and we have in our mind the idea of the chair. What Descartes is saying is that, okay, I exist as a mind. I have ideas. The question we need to know is, how do I know if those ideas in my mind in any way correspond to an external world? My main question now concerns the ideas that I take to come from things outside me. Why do I think they, the ideas, resemble these things, the objects? So we have in our mind a picture, a perception of an external world. How do you know what's going on inside your head in any way looks like the real world out there? We started with epistemology. We started with these questions of knowledge. What can I know? Right? Knowledge is in the mind. And now we've moved from epistemology, from the mind, to metaphysics, to the world. So, Descartes is bored. Descartes is lonely. Descartes knows one thing and one thing only. He exists. Exists as a thinking thing, a disembodied floating mind. If you're all alone, just a mind with no body, no external world, it gets boring. It gets lonely. You think corona world is bad? At least you have a body. Sure, it can't go out, be around other people. He doesn't even have that. So, if you were all alone, you're bored, what do you want? A friend. Who would be the best friend to hang out with? God, right? Clearly, he's got the really good Netflix account, right? I mean, this is God after all. So the point is, if there was anybody else you'd want to be with in the universe, the all-being would probably be a really good choice. But anyway, he can with absolute certainty show that God must exist. And he does that in Meditation 3 with his famous argument that we now call the anthropomorphic argument. That is, we call it that because it comes from his humanness, from his being a human with a mind. And we can reconstruct the argument that he gives in Meditation 3 in this way. We start with the claim that he doubts. Now, we can't deny this, right? He's a thinking thing. He knows what he's thinking. He doesn't know if the content of the thought actually hooks up with the world or not, but he at least knows what he is thinking. And can we deny that Descartes is doubting? Well, for 2.5 meditations, all he's done is doubt everything. So clearly we got to grant premise 1, right? Descartes doubts. Then he says, look, a perfect being wouldn't doubt. A perfect being would know everything, including the fact that they know everything, right? When do you doubt something? You doubt something when you're not sure if you know it. So if you knew what you knew, then you'd know that you know it, which means you would never doubt. So a perfect being would never doubt. But Descartes does doubt. So what does that mean? Here's where we get to number 3. Descartes is not perfect. Okay. But he says, look, I'm a thinking thing. I'm a thing that thinks. What do I think about? One of the things I think about is God. Now, I don't know whether it exists or not, but I at least know what I'm thinking. And it's clear that I do have the idea of a perfect being, right? The thinking thing thinks about God. Okay. Then he makes this metaphysical claim. The lesser cannot give rise to the greater, right? The idea is everything has a degree of perfection inherent within it. When that thing creates something, it can only endow the creation with as much perfection as it has. You can't create something more perfect than you. Where would you get the extra perfection, right? I mean, you can't walk to your neighbor, excuse me, can I borrow a cup of perfection, right? The idea here is you can't create anything more perfect than you are, so the lesser cannot give rise to the greater. Now, he's imperfect, but he has the idea of a perfect being. The idea is more perfect than he is. So he concludes in 6, I can't be the source of the idea. It's more perfect than me, and you can't create something more perfect than you are. So he argues there must be a source of the idea with at least as much perfection as the idea, right? The idea is you can only create something as perfect as you are. So whatever gave rise to this perfect idea has to have as much perfection. But look, the idea is absolutely perfect. So the only thing that could have created something that's absolutely perfect must itself be absolutely perfect. So therefore, there must exist an absolutely perfect thing to be the source of the idea. That is, he concludes, God exists. So we have a disembodied floating thinking thing, and now we have our second absolute truth, the existence of an all-perfect God. Where does that leave us? That leaves us where we will pick up tomorrow with the last three of Descartes' Meditations. So I will see you then.